Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining the fourth Global Corporate Sustainability Forum, GCSM in 2021. The workshop starts with a welcome remark by Chairman of Taiwan Institute for Sustainable Energy, Dr. Eugene Chen.
Welcome to the fourth Global Corporate Sustainability Forum, GCSF, in 2021, hosted by Alliance for Sustainable Development Goals, executed by Taiwan Institute for Sustainable Energy. The forum creates a platform which will connect all fields of expertise in Taiwan to the international society. Towards a net zero future is a theme for 2021. It is foreseeable that through a series of events in this forum, we are building an image for a future in net zero carbon emission, lead to a road path towards a net zero carbon emissions in 2050. The 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference of Parties, COP26, held in November, led to a net zero carbon emission actions globally. GCSF has a special meaning during this historical moment. The forum gathered senior executives to share their strategies in achieving net zero carbon emission. Throughout the forum, 2 online forums, 2 summits, and 15 workshops were held by 12 partners and organizers. The online workshop held especially for international experts who are unable to attend this forum physically. Speakers are invited from Japan, Hong Kong, Italy, Taiwan, UK, and the United States. 2021 is a year of milestones for climate transformation and sustainable investments. Let us continue to participate and witness this critical turning point in achieving a net zero future. Thank you and enjoy the forum.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Chen. And now let's give the time to our moderator, Mr. Donald Eubank, the principal of Read the Air. Let's welcome Donald Eubank.
Apologies for that. So thank you, Wayne, and I'm very happy to join today. I'd like to thank all our panelists as well who are with us. Today we have Ian Anderson from Standard Chartered Bank. We have Dr. Chiara Maria Sassu from H&M, Martin Townsend from BSI Group, and Verna Lin from GRI. We'll get to longer introductions to each of them in a minute. But before we started this session, I just wanted to provide a little framing for the subject that we're talking about today, which is transforming to a net zero future. So I'm just going to present a few slides to give us some context on why we're discussing this important issue. Before I do that, just a quick self-intro. As I said, my name is Donald Eubank. I'm a climate asset lead at Climate Resources Exchange, which is a full-service carbon consultancy company. We do anything from carbonization strategies to developing carbon projects and finding financing for such projects. I'm also the co-author of the book Leading Sustainably, The Path to Sustainable Business and How the SDGs Changed Everything with Trista Bridges, which is a practical guide for business managers to make decisions with sustainability in mind, to put it at the core of their operations, opposed to have it as a peripheral function. To write this book, we did about 2 years of research, interviewed 100 different business leaders, investors, policymakers, NGOs, and other change makers and thought leaders. And with Trista, I also founded Read the Air, which is a sustainable business consultancy that focuses more on the management consulting side of how to transform your business into a sustainable business model. So about today's subject, I just wanted to share, this is now a month old, but this is just a series of headlines from Carbon Pulse Daily, just to show how quickly this field of carbon pricing, carbon offsetting, and carbon neutral is developing. So on Wednesday, the 29th, there are 2 headlines about China could reach its carbon neutral goal for 2060 early, and Australia was setting higher ambitions. So we've started to see countries set targets, and they're increasing their ambitions to hit them. We've also seen news about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, first out of the EU, and also the US has mentioned it. And there's even discussions of countries such as America, China, partnering with the EU to create a carbon club that essentially says that any product that goes into these markets would have to have a levy against the carbon that was contained in the product. So we're seeing cross-border impacts for companies that are selling into markets that want to protect their businesses that already have carbon prices. The prices of EAUs, the EU allowances, are hitting all-time highs. Right now, they're about $60. So we see in the compliance markets that the prices are really starting to have effect, and the voluntary markets themselves, with COP26 happening this week, have gone up to $11, and they're looking to go about $13 per ton of carbon. So we're seeing a lot of price rise, and we're seeing increasing sophistication in the markets. We're seeing financialization of carbon in different kinds of products, ETFs and indexes. And we're also seeing speculators come in to take positions in carbon so that they can hold on to actually get bigger prices later, which actually reduces the access to companies that want to do offsetting. So there's a lot of developments going on here. How did this come about? Well, just 6 years ago in 2015, there are only about 17 jurisdictions that had pricing in their policies, whether it's a carbon tax or it's an emission trading scheme like the EU. If you flash forward to 2020, we're now at 64 different policies in different jurisdictions that are either implemented or planned to be implemented. That equals about 12 gigatons of carbon, which is 22% of the carbon emissions in the world. At the same time, we've seen commitments from different countries. China last year committed to a net zero 2060 target. South Korea followed with a net zero 2050 target, and Japan followed with another net zero 2050 target. I see that Taiwan itself is exploring a pricing mechanism that could come into play by the year 2023. And at the same time, as I mentioned with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, there's these other policies or mechanisms that are possibly going to impact companies that are even outside of jurisdictions that have policies. So there's the CBAM that imposes a levy on carbon imported from other markets. Right now, they're focusing on cement, aluminum, fertilizer, iron and steel, the heavy emission industries. As well as there's the EU taxonomy on sustainable finance, and that actually starts to define what is a sustainable business activity and could have an impact on the cost of capital for businesses that are working in spaces that are more emission intensive. But we like to talk as well about an opportunity. This is not simply a risk that companies are facing. There's an opportunity for companies that start to solve the problems around emissions in products or in production lines. The WEF prices at about $10 trillion in business value that can be unlocked. So what can companies do today that are looking at their emissions and trying to figure out how to reduce them? Well, the first step is to reduce them directly within your own emissions in your own operations. And this is coming from Dr. Jonathan Foley, who's the executive director of Project Drawdown, which lists the projects that have the types of projects that have the most positive impact for reducing emissions. So these are experts' opinions here. Companies can switch to renewables in their power use. We see a lot of companies starting to do that, either through power purchase agreements with renewable energy providers or through buying IRECs, renewable energy certificates. You can take a circular approach to the resources in your own products, reducing the resources you need or actually capturing carbon in your production. And you can look upstream to your supply chain and work downstream with your customers to actually reduce the emissions in the total value chain. As well, there's offsetting, which is the fastest way for companies to move to net zero, but really they should be used sparingly because over the long term, it's not sustainable to use this strategy. And if you do choose to do it, you should focus first on offsets that either avoid or reduce emissions today. You can look to offsets that use nature, remove carbon later. And sort of the last choice you should have are these new technologies, these nascent technologies for carbon removal. They're really the riskiest option because they're unproven. We don't know the cost of them today, and we don't know when the technologies will actually be viable. So I'd just like to end by saying that anyone who's starting to look at this market, it's kind of like the 6 blind men and the elephant. It's very difficult to see the whole of it. And the interesting thing about this parable is that these blind men all had an opinion before they encountered the market. And even once they did encounter the market and they went back to talk about it, they each still had a different vision of what the elephant was. So I think the goal of what we're doing today by bringing together this panel of experts is to try to see the whole of the elephant when it comes to net zero carbon, and the carbon markets. With that, I will stop, and I will invite Ian to take over the stage.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you, Donald. Look, Mr. Chen, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, good afternoon. I certainly like Donald's analogy of the elephant, because how true is that, and in particular in this particular subject matter. Look, I'm Ian Anderson, CEO of Standard Chartered Taiwan, and on behalf of Standard Chartered Bank, I'd like to thank the Taiwan Institute for Sustainable Energy for having us here at this important event today, and also during, obviously, COP26. There's a lot of activity going on, as we all know, in the news. It's our pleasure to be able to share our thoughts and actions around moving towards net zero. It's not easy. I think we all understand that. And importantly for me as well, to learn from everyone here in terms of insights and experiences. So a little bit of introduction. I think we'll all agree climate change is irrefutably the biggest challenge for us today. And if left unaddressed, it will potentially have devastating impacts on us, our planet, and our children's planet as well, importantly. And like all challenges, the opportunity to contribute and make a tangible difference is also very great. And I think banks have a really critical role to play in supporting clients make that transition to a more sustainable future, as well as being able to measure the risk impact on bank itself, such as ourselves. We're helping emerging markets in our footprint reduce carbon emissions as fast as possible without slowing development. And our objective is putting the world on a sustainable path to net zero by 2050. I think Wayne, if we go to slide 1, thank you. So look, why does it matter to banks? I think, Wayne, if you can put slide 1 on, thank you. Look, climate risk manifests through combination, as you can see on the chart here, physical risks and transition risks. So physical risks, think of, directly arising from changing climate itself. So acute risks such as typhoons in Taiwan, or chronic risks such as rising sea levels. These occurrences typically have material impacts, damage on physical assets, disruption to supply chains, and the like. And I think we all know we've witnessed a lot of these extreme weather events during 2021 and should anticipate we see more in the future. And then you have transition risks, perhaps a little bit more complicated, but they arise typically from not anticipating the economic, social, and political changes required to transition to a low carbon world. And then transition risks are typically viewed through the lens of policy, technology, societal preferences. So take examples like the introduction of carbon taxes, which has just been talked about, increased adoption of electric vehicles spurred by technology advances and changes around battery life, as an example, or societal preferences. So how consumers organize their lives, their purchasing behaviors, their investment decisions, their employment decisions, and the like. And also, it was touched on previously, having an effective carbon market to assist with the transition to a net zero world is also really critical. There are certain emissions that are very difficult to abate, and so there is a role for the carbon market to exist. And I think even the size of the largest carbon offset market, being the EU, it's not sufficient today. So at Standard Chartered, we have made climate risk in terms of what we do at the center of everything we do. We see it as a cross-cutting risk. You can see in the bottom of the chart, and it manifests in financial and non-financial risks. I think if we can go to slide 2, Wayne, thank you. Look, in terms of commitment, responsibility, various pressures externally, we know we need to keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees centigrade. We know we must transition to net zero emissions by 2050. As Standard Chartered, we've committed to reaching net zero in our own operations by 2030, and then from our financing by 2050. We've got targets in place to reduce our energy use and report our progress every year. And we've been doing that for around the last decade. And our climate impacts are primarily from our clients, actually, so those that we finance and we support. We aim to measure, manage, and ultimately reduce those emissions related to our operations and the financing of our clients. And we're also seeing increased regulatory and commercial pressure and expectations across a wide range of stakeholders. And we should rightly anticipate that that increases over time. If we can move to slide 3, please. Wayne, if we can move to slide 3, thank you. Look, our sustainability aspirations play a key role in setting our targets to guide our approach. And one of our most important aspirations is reducing our own impact on the environment and reducing and reaching net zero carbon emissions from our own operations. And the table there is a lift and drop from our TCFD disclosures and highlights various targets and our progress that we've made across those targets, whether it's in terms of energy efficiency, water efficiency, reducing paper consumption, and the likes. If we can move to slide 4, Wayne, thank you. A little bit of Taiwan progress. So how are we doing? Well, you can see in the chart, the bottom left, we've reduced carbon emissions as well as our energy consumption, and we intend to do so going forward. We're moving to our more energy efficient and environmentally friendly head office at the end of this year, and we'll be targeting getting LEED certification for that during the course of 2022. It's really important. We have about 3,000 people. They're part of the journey here in Taiwan with us. We want to encourage them to echo our green ambition by engaging them through green volunteering activities, practicing daily green habits, convening paperless meetings, recycling, avoiding the use of single plastic, and engaging them broadly in terms of getting their ideas and input. And we also get our suppliers to support us in terms of the use of goods and services, how we select suppliers as well to mitigate our environmental impact that we have. So in terms of achieving net zero from our financing by 2050, these are group targets. We recently announced ambitious new interim 2030 targets on the 28th of October for the most carbon intensive sectors, and our methodology as well for pathway to net zero by 2050. And we've got details in a recent white paper that I just referenced, so please do take a look at your leisure. We've set our plan to cut finance emissions, mobilize capital, accelerate solutions to support what we see as a just transition in our markets, and we operate in upwards of 60 markets globally. We plan to mobilize $300 billion in green and transition finance by 2030. Our approach is based on the best data currently available, and it aligns to the International Energy Agency net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. And we believe that the markets in which we operate, they have both the greatest opportunity to adopt low carbon technology and some of the toughest transition financing and climate challenges that exist. These sectors represent approximately 62.5% of our overall absolute financed emissions baseline. And the below left table figure provides an overview of financed emissions by assets in scope by sector. The data coverage in these sectors is higher than the average across the portfolio. And then for each of the 3 sectors, we've defined emission reduction targets that are aligned with our ambition to reach net zero financed emissions by 2050, so that you can see that in figure 2. And then in line with our baseline, we've drawn upon 2 main target metrics for our commitments. So for all sectors except coal mining, we've opted for revenue-based carbon intensity reduction targets instead of absolute emissions. We're setting interim targets for the most carbon intensive sectors, and we'll continue to report our progress against those. We aim to reduce absolute finance thermal coal mining emissions by 85% by 2030, and that's in addition to the existing prohibition that we have on financing new or expanding coal-fired power plants. And we also aim to reduce 63% for power, 33% for steel, and 30% for oil and gas. And these are interim 2030 targets. In terms of sustainable finance, look, we have a wide range of sustainable finance products and innovation. So from green loans, green bonds, sustainability linked loans, supply chain financing, green deposits, our advisory business. And in Taiwan, interestingly, we're the first foreign bank to launch mortgages linked to energy efficiency. And we also offer our clients a range of sustainable investments such as ESG mutual funds. And we're actually seeing a lot of increased demand and appetite for that. And we'll expect to see that over time as well. We're creating sustainable finance products to support sustainable development. I think this is a really important aspect that a bank can bring to the goal to reach net zero. It's important to avoid greenwashing. So our frameworks are developed in collaboration with the likes of Sustainalytics and other third parties. And we set out what qualifies as sustainable and green products, and we have a various governance structure to manage that. In Taiwan, we support the Green Financing Action Plan 2.0, the government. We funded around 12 billion NT dollars in renewable related projects up to 2020, and that includes 1.6 gigawatts of offshore wind projects, and will continue to provide financing in the future. We also closed a $505 million sustainability linked loan with ASE Group, and we're proud, of course, to be part of ASE's commitment to sustainability. So there's a lot of things that are going on in Taiwan and globally for us as an organization. But this is an interesting slide. This depicts the growth of the sustainability market. You can see there's been rapid growth, and actually by mid 2021, market volumes are actually in excess of 2020 total volumes. And you may say, wow, but actually it's insufficient, right? There remains a significant gap. Donald mentioned 10 trillion. We have a similar number, 10 trillion financing gap stroke opportunity for financing SDGs when we did a survey in 15 of our key emerging markets by 2030. So there's a huge financing gap for banks to facilitate and other financial businesses as well. If we can go to slide 8, but we like to publish thought leadership along with others. I've given 3 examples here. So on the left, you have Zeronomics, and that's a study in the financing of net zero world, where we surveyed senior leadership of 250 large corporates and 100 investment specialists and this was in 2020. And so really interesting results. So for example, 47% of senior execs say that their organization fully supports the aims of the Paris Agreement. That may well have gone up during COP26. 55% of business leaders believe their companies are not transitioning fast enough. And 71% of companies plan to make the most towards net zero between 2030 and 2050. So one could argue there's a risk that the 2020s become a lost decade. I think some of that gap will have been closed with various commitments at COP26, but there is a big gap to fill. I think one of the reasons for that is that actually the transition finance gap is considered the biggest challenge to achieve net zero by 2050. So 67% of our corporates and 85% of our investors agreed that actually a lack of capital is the biggest barrier to corporates achieving net zero transition. The survey carbon dated in the middle, that was 400 sustainability and supply chain experts at multinational corporates across the globe. And this report revealed, interestingly, 78% of multinational corporates will potentially remove suppliers that endanger their carbon transition by 2023. So that's real close. So this isn't, we're not talking 2030 and beyond, that's 2023. So there's quite a lot of pressure that we're seeing on suppliers and the supply chain to take swift, decisive action on sustainability. And there's a role that banks play in facilitating the financing of that shift that we expect to see. And then on the right, I think that what I would call out here is that we're just seeing more interest from our investors in sustainable investing products and an increasing demand in that area. And we fully anticipate that that will continue. And actually here in Taiwan, we're putting more product on our shelf for our investors and customers. So just to close, look, I think we would all agree there is no time to waste here. So whether it's governments, regulators, consumers, corporations, financial institutions like ourselves and investors, we've all got a role to play. And it's not just averting the disaster, but it's using what we term the emergency to catalyze that innovation and collaboration. And the objective has to be to help us leapfrog into the future so that we have a better entire community than what we do today. And we have a good chance of reaching net zero by 2050. So look, I thank you again for having me here and having the opportunity to speak and share with you. So thank you. I'll hand back to Donald.
Thank you, Ian. Very interesting activities that you're doing there. I look forward to asking you some questions later. Next, we have Dr. Chiara Maria Sassu from H&M. She's the Regional Sustainability Director out of Shanghai, and she'll be talking about some of the innovations that H&M is supporting, identifying and supporting to actually reduce emissions in their own value chain. So Dr. Sassu.
Hello, everyone. This is Chiara Maria Sassu, in charge for sustainability for H&M in the region Greater China. And I think we all agree that business as usual is not going to work if we really want to access all our goals when it comes to carbon neutrality and even to be carbon positive by 2040. That's the goal that H&M has set up for itself. And so today I would like to walk you through the efforts that the H&M Group is doing to drive a sustainable, like a zero carbon fashion future through innovation. And I think you can see it here in the slide. H&M has been around since 1947, and we have been innovators since then. And since then, we have been constantly looking for new ideas, designs, technologies to satisfy the demands of the customers. And it's very clear that if we want to be able to keep doing this for many decades ahead within the planet boundaries, then we need to be on a journey to make fashion sustainable and carbon positive then by 2040. Climate change is obviously one of the greatest challenges that we have in the modern era for all industries, including fashion. And as a leading player in the fashion industry, obviously because of our size, then we have again a clear commitment. And I feel that this commitment is can be found all the way since the past into the future. So next click, please. We opened our first store in 1947 in a small city in Sweden. And then next click, please. And then fast forward to 2010. In the meanwhile, we had a huge expansion across all Europe. And in 2010, for the first time among all the fashion players, we launched the first collection made entirely out of sustainable materials. And that moment was a little bit the kickoff of all the sustainable initiatives that will follow. Next click, please. In 2013, we were the first one to set up a garment collecting in every single store worldwide. And since then, thousands of tons of old textiles have been collected for reuse and recycling. And then next click brings us to the topic that I would like to talk to you about today. And it's about the H&M Foundation. Maybe some of you have heard about this before. Maybe for someone, it's a completely new topic. The H&M Foundation in 2015 launched the first edition of the Global Change Award. And the Global Change Award is a challenge designed to spur innovation that can accelerate then the shift from a linear to a circular fashion industry. So H&M Foundation was born as just to challenge the status quo and to look a little bit outside of the H&M box, even though it's a very big box, it's still a box, for new and innovative solutions. It is a non-profit organization operating completely independently from the H&M Group. And the idea was to co-create, fund, and share solutions for a planet-positive fashion future. The ambition, so through all these efforts, the general ambition is to help accelerate the realization of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The Global Change Award. So every year, innovators from all over the world are basically invited to submit their early stage ideas across five themes that are biodiversity, climate, land, ocean, and water. Among all the pool of ideas that the H&M Foundation receives, the sixth most promising innovation share grant of €1 million and participate in an accelerator program where the H&M Group, together with the partners, help bring these ideas to life. Until now, the Global Change Award, I think, has received more than 20,000 entry, and they are like constantly on the look for new ideas. Let me just share that a little bit more about this accelerator program that is part of the prize for the award, because this is run together in a partnership between the H&M Foundation and the Royal Institute of Technology back in Sweden. So this is really an enabler for the winners to accelerate towards impact and scale, because I think also Ian mentioned before, like the lack of capital, it is always a barrier, right, for any kind of innovation. So by making the winners part of this accelerator program, then they are enabled to scale up. And also, once the program is over, all the winners join the alumni community with all the past winners, and so then they can still receive and share tips, support, and network with each other. So then what I would like to do is to share a couple of ideas that won the award last year, to give you a little bit of inspiration, because I think, again, it is about finding new ways to make the business sustainable. So you can see here on the screen, do you know what you're wearing? If you are like most people, most probably you are wearing at least one thing that is made partly out of polyester, because polyester is one of the most common materials in today's fashion industry. And conventional polyester is made out of petroleum in a process that emits huge amounts of greenhouse gases. Obviously, it is clear right now that we cannot handle the increasing level of CO2. So wouldn't it be great if there was a way to turn textile production into a part of the solution instead of the problem? Actually, there is a way. If we go to next slide, please. And it's about Fairbricks project. So they won last year. So instead of emitting CO2 into the air, the gas is trapped, activated, and then transformed into sustainable polyester pellets. So the result is a sustainable fabric that looks and feels like regular polyester. And actually, the more thread we make, the better it is for the planet. It is, if we think about the potential of this idea, once it's scaled up in the right way, then I find it extremely exciting. So what is the color of the season? I'm wearing white. I guess most of the audience is wearing something black, but maybe there is someone that is wearing the color of the season. They say green olive for this fall. But anyway, for many people, new seasons mean new color trends. But before the latest fashion piece caught your attention, most likely it went through an extensive dyeing and finishing process in the factory. And this undertaking emits great volumes of greenhouse gases and pollutes the water. And that's not even the end of it, because polluted water turns into a thick toxic sludge that is really hard to handle. So every day, the apparel industry generates hundreds of tons of this sludge that very often ends up then in landfill. So Sea Change Technologies, also another one of the winners for last year, is a solution that connects a small gadget to the existing systems. So basically, in this way, the water is separated from the toxins with the help of a jet turbine. So there is zero sludge, basically. Instead, the toxins are like separated into a powder, while the water is then clean. It's clean water, and it's turned into a mist that can be released or potentially even reused. And through this process, of course, the carbon footprint is significantly reduced. Again, it's a process that is always on. Next slide, please. To give you, this is a very simple overview about what is happening right now. So for the 2021 edition of the Global Change Award, we have just finished the application process. So we are now screening all the ideas. The winners will be announced in the spring. And then from that moment, we will start with the Innovation Accelerator for 1 year. While in the meanwhile, I'm sure, personally, I am very curious to see what the next ideas will be. But for now, I just wanted again to underline how the way we see it is that things need to change, and we need to find creative and innovative ways of dealing with our business going forward. And sometimes we find that the most creativity is in very small, very young organizations. And so then with the network that we have and the resources that we have, then the H&M Group is making an effort to helping these young and creative organizations to then scale up. And that is everything for me. Thank you. Back to you, Donald.
Great, thank you, Chiara. Thank you for sharing those 2 startups with us. We actually featured 2 other that H&M had invested in the book. So I know that H&M has a real commitment to innovation. I look forward to asking you some questions about those later and about the relationship of H&M Foundation to the company itself. Next, we have Martin Thompson, who's the head of sustainability and circular economy at the BSI Group. Martin, I believe you're going to speak to us about how to drive the transformation and how businesses can be successful.
My name's Martin Townsend. I kind of see my role to some extent as the head gardener, trying to help businesses to improve. And I think that fits really well in terms of the context of what we've heard already today about lots of ideas and the pace of change. So Wayne, if you could go to the next slide, please. When I was putting together this presentation, I was thinking about the conversation we're going to be having today. So I'm really looking forward to the questions in the Q&A session as well. And I think one of the most important things to think about is that sustainability is a word that's used by everybody, but actually in the context of what we want to talk about today, it's about how do you strengthen and support your business to improve, and what skills do you need to do that? And I'm hoping through the course of my presentation and all the ones you've heard today that we're really going to be doing that. And I think in the context of that, one of the most important issues that we need to really embrace, I suppose, is collaboration. And we've heard that from the last speaker, and we've heard that from Ian as well, that a lot of change is taking place. And one of the most important parts of that change is innovation and collaboration, because together as organizations, in terms of understanding the market dynamics, will we actually make real change happen on the ground? Because if you listen to the conversations coming out of COP26, there's a massive amount of activity, there's a massive amount of talk, but actually, are we in the right place in terms of where we need to be with regards to things like the Paris Agreement? So I think there's much more change that is going to take place. In terms of scene setting, my conversation, I suppose, is very much about carbon, but I suppose I wanted to put a word of caution out there in the context of the carbon conversation, because people do become very fixated on it for the right reasons. But actually, if we're going to be successful, it's about understanding the interrelationships about the whole of sustainability. I'm a firm believer in the 6 capital model, that if we start to look at organizational change, there are a lot of components in this process that need to interconnect. So if we start to think about innovation, actually making sure our staff and the way we engage them and the way we train them and the way we develop them is a fundamental part of actually creating the right culture. So that the whole idea about making sure that we're thinking about our staff, our human capital, the way we engage the industry, our social capital, making sure that we're thinking about the financial capital, so the points that Ian's mentioned already today, are important parts of this process. So although we're going to focus around carbon and we understand what we need to do around that debate, we also need to make sure that we're really thinking about the whole as well. And I think that's incredibly important so that we're moving the debate forward in terms of using our talent, thinking about the risks related to our financial investments, thinking about our environment in terms of how we're using our resources more efficiently. So the last speaker is, I think, a really good example of that, making sure that we're thinking about the environmental capital in the most effective way. All of those things are about driving change in a holistic way, thinking about moving things forward in a way that joins things together. The one thing that I was reflecting on as I was kind of putting together my slides is that when we think about some of the conversations that are happening this week at COP, it's very easy to look at the gap. It's very easy to look at the things we have still yet to do, but actually it's important to think about the gain as well. So what have we actually achieved in this conversation? So if we look back to the period between 2015 and 2020, and we just look at some of the rate of change that's happening around us, there's a massive amount of change. And some of these statistics from a recent survey from Harvard, if we look at the growth in energy renewables, it's grown by 50% in that period. If we look at the use or the access to electric vehicles, that's gone up 900%. And I think if we look at those in isolation, we're seeing access to new forms of mobility. But actually what it's also doing, it's challenging us to think about the whole ecosystem of energy. And so great conversations I'm having at the moment with various organizations across the world. What does this mean in terms of how we operate? So if we start to think about the use of energy in terms of renewable, we're starting to see car companies becoming energy companies to make sure that as those renewable sources or cars are being used as storage, we can actually move energy around the world as well. So I think that's becoming incredibly important in terms of not only starting to think about things in isolation, but thinking about things in terms of how they connect together. So if we start to think about the change that's going on, how does that really affect what we're doing? So when we think about urban development, we're starting to see a change in terms of the access to vehicles. So we're starting to see mobility as a service. We're starting to think about how that really starts to understand how we're seeing a changing world. I'm not sure what's happened to the slides, but I think they might have just gone onto the wrong view. So in terms of the pace of change, in terms of what's going on, we need to see the connectivity between those services. If we can go on to the next slide, Wayne. In part of that process, for me, it's very much about ensuring that we understand how this journey maps together. So when I talk to organizations about the carbon journey and the process of change, for me, it's really about having 4 building blocks. It's about an organization making a commitment to change, and that needs to come from the most senior level in the organization, making sure there's a clear commitment within the business to achieve a net zero target, to become carbon neutral, making sure that in that process of commitment, you have an assessment in terms of where you are. And like any good business, you can't improve your business until you know exactly where you are. So I think the role of audit and in terms of collecting the right information in the right way is fairly fundamental to that process. So making sure that you can assess. Once you've actually got that assessment in terms of your current business practices and that commitment from the senior executives in terms of where you are, it is then about managing. How can I actually take where I am at the moment and start to think about that improvement? And I think lots of the previous speakers have talked about this already, about building on the practice of what you're doing, but also making sure that you're learning from best practice. And I think standards play an incredibly important role in that process. So managing, but in that process of managing, making sure that you continue to monitor as you continue to change. And as one of the previous speakers has already talked about, that's about being creative. That's about thinking about your business model. So the issue of things like circularity, understanding your product and understanding how you can reuse it, understanding if you're moving from a product economy to a service economy, making sure you really understand, not just in terms of your current activities, but how you can actually think very, very differently as an organization. As was mentioned before, in this journey of change, I think there is a step which we all probably need to take, which is not the long-term step of getting to net zero, but actually, how do I then start to think about offsetting? So if I think about I'm reducing my current impact, part of one of the issues that you'll probably consider is how do I then think about offsetting? So BSI is in a very good position in terms of thinking about this space, because we're working at the moment with the task force for scaling voluntary carbon markets to actually create the standard and to create the governance model around what does good offsetting look like. And I think that becomes important because, as was mentioned by Ian before, if we are going to drive change, it is about making sure that we do that in a way that allows people to become part of that conversation, making sure that we see the benefits sometimes in local communities, so maybe developing community forests or thinking about initiatives which can really make that change happen. And then I know that Verna's probably going to mention this, but part of this process of change is about making sure that we can really demonstrate that we're doing this in the right way. One of the key important elements, I think, that's happening in the world is a need for transparency. Organizations in the past have made commitments, but they haven't necessarily always stuck to those commitments. And therefore, making sure that we really build that in terms of declaring and reporting and showing progress is a fundamental part of that process. So that process of committing, assessing, managing, offsetting and declaring, I think, are your journey or your steps of the journey you need to take against the target that you want to take in terms of being net zero by a set period in time. And there are lots of ambitious targets out there. There are lots of organizations that really want to make that progress. If I look to my last slide, I think it's a really important kind of capture, I suppose, which is a quote from the Financial Times during COP, which is, those organizations that innovate and change will be those organizations that survive and grow. Those organizations that don't innovate will be those that fail. And I think that's a fairly hard message, but I think it's an important message to share with those listening today. And hopefully that's going to trigger some questions.
And last, we have Verna Lin, who's the head of the Greater China Regional Hub for GRI, which is the godfather of measurement and disclosure around sustainability issues, environmental, social, and governance ones. So Verna, why don't you present your presentation now?
Yes, I will do that. Thank you, Donald. And thanks, Martin, for briefly mentioning my name. We had a pre-meeting a couple weeks ago, and I was gonna steal Martin's idea, but after a session, I think Martin stole some of mine. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Verna Lin, and I'm representing the Global Reporting Initiative, known as GRI, in Greater China Regional Hub. I'd like to express our appreciation to the organizer, TISE, for having us here today. And I'm connecting from Hong Kong. So my 10-minute session is about the importance of credible reporting for net zero target commitment. Countries and companies are making public announcement, commitment or promises of their ambitious targets, right? But when scrutinized, not all of them are actually reporting it with accuracy and credibility. So this is the angle I'm gonna talk about today. So say when you set the target, for instance, that you're gonna cut 55% of carbon emission by 2035. How do you communicate your target with the market as well as your stakeholders in a transparent and credible way? how do you report your progress? How do you manage the progress? And what if you do not reach the annual targets? And for all of us, how do we avoid carbon washing, right? So I listed here some of the GRI standards and disclosures that are directly relevant to energy consumption, reduction and emissions in your sustainability or ESG reports. And the newly launched Oil and Gas Sector Standard 2021 also provides a comprehensive and globally applicable reporting standard for the sustainability impacts for the oil and gas sector, which we know has the biggest environmental impact, to address layer share impacts on our planet. And then I'm not gonna talk about the detail of those relevant GI standards today, but I do wanted to have an introduction of the EU climate standard prototype working paper, which I am assuming a lot of our participants today have not much information about that. This chart is captured from the GRI 3 Material Topic 2021, which is replacing the GRI 103 Management Approach 2016. And the reason why I wanted to describe this process, it kind of presents a revised approach to materiality. So we could take reference from this process to identify companies' actual and potential negative impacts across the organization's activities and business relationships. So I wanted to emphasize here, we are looking at the impacts not just from the organization's activity itself, but also their business relationship with their business partners, right? And so the management of the material topic, including information on specific policies. So here we insert the net zero carbon target. How do you set the goals and target? What's your actions to prevent, mitigate, and remediate negative impacts, and the effectiveness of the action taken? You could all disclose here. So it's kind of like a step-by-step guidance on how to determine your material topic. And besides that, it's also a practical guidance on how you engage with your shareholders and stakeholders regularly. So if you are looking for a framework to report and communicate your target, policies, and implementation plans of your net zero commitments, we all know under the EU Green Deal, the European Commission is developing a draft EU Sustainability Reporting Standards. And under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, that is called CSRD, there's this climate standard prototype working paper was presented to the plenary meeting on 8th of September this year. So it's just a couple months ago. Obviously, they're under a lot of time pressure, right? And there are 3 key goals of the climate standard. So one of the key goals I wanted to mention here is from the very beginning, the EU Commission is determined not to reinvent the wheel. So in this climate standard prototype, they are seeking compatibility and alignment with the recommendations of TCFD as well as the GRI standards. They are also having the discussion with the IFRS Foundation, and they also have established the contact with the United Standards regulator, SEC. The contact has been established. So, so this document was disclosed for transparency purpose, and they provide all the stakeholders to have a understanding on the operation, initial thinking and the direction of these projects. And this working paper, it's not open for public consultation at this stage. And GRI is closely having this involvement and a direct, helping with the EFRAG to developing the standards as well as this working paper. So this is the overview of this climate standard content. Start with strategy, followed by implementations that comprise policies and targets, actions and resources. And then where so in the policies and targets where you describe and disclose your target and policies. And the third section is about performance measurement. So that it includes other carbon emissions and mix, consumption, scope 1, 2, and 3, right? So obviously, this is kind of a very brief introduction, but this provides a very universal and global framework for everybody to use. This is open to download. You can just go to EU or you could just Google it, okay? And let's look at a little bit about the next slide. So I'm going a little bit fast here, but I have 4 minutes something, right? So if we look into the second section of implementation, the policies, there are 2 key disclosures. So the first one is policy commitment on climate change mitigation. And the second one is policy commitment on climate change adaptation. So again, you could take some aspirations of fitting all your strategies into this framework based on GRI universal standards, which we described earlier. Is you provide and describe your policy commitments related to climate change mitigation and adaptation. You also detail the contents, parameters with regards to the value chain. Here, I wanted to emphasize it's not just your own operation, but also your value chain and how they are communicated to stakeholders, including your business partners. Then you lay out how the policy commitments are implemented with your own operation as well as the value chain. So this is about the policy. And then if we go next to the slide, and this is a little bit about the total energy consumption and the adapted from the CDP and GRI. And so it's the cross-cutting chart. It's to provide you also how to lay out your energy consumption in different form. So I think I'm a little bit just ahead of my time, but basically I wanted to mention here is EU is having this ambition of creating a Green Deal, and under the Green Deal is the developing of a global sustainability standard, which all the international initiatives are working closely together, including the GRI standards. So it's all about transparency and how you communicate your impact on the environment and communicate your impact with your stakeholders in a credible way. And this is pretty much conclude my sessions, and I am looking forward to having a discussion with all the panelists. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Verna. I think that there's a lot that we can discuss there, especially about stakeholders, which I think is a very interesting question, because we're talking a lot, I think, now about this shift from a shareholder view of the world to a stakeholder view of the world. And that's something that businesses need to learn more about exactly what that encompasses. So there's a couple of themes I'm interested in looking at. I'm interested in looking at this question of stakeholders, at carbon pricing, as well as like how you use carbon pricing internally, and then what are the practical activities businesses can do to start to actually reduce their emissions. But Verna, first I wanted to ask you just a quick small question. For your climate disclosure, I see you mentioned working with CDP. In future years, how will GRI manage disclosures that are used with GRI? Would you use a CDP style database where you would collect all this information in a central location?
Okay, so thanks, Donald, for the question. I wanted to provide a little bit clarification here, because in the past 1 year, we've been seeing like the international discussion or so-called debate, because GRI has been doing the sustainability standard and framework for 20 years, but recent years, it's become a global spotlight, right? First of all, we need to recognize there's a difference between standards, framework, and questionnaire. So basically, GRI is a standard, set of standard that follow due process. TCFD is a recommendation, so it's a framework. CDP is essentially a questionnaire, right? So, and I'm apologize, like my session, I think I've been a little bit rushed, but what you are seeing, the climate prototype was not developed by GRI, it was developed by EU Commission under the CSRD. So it's the whole, so EU as, we to be honest, we all know, like, so European is much more advanced in terms of setting a standard, and that's the EU's ambition to become the first continent, and they are setting a global standard, right? So this project is under the Green Deal, EU Green Deal, and there is a CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Under this proposal, there is the plan to develop a set of global sustainability standard. And I wanted to repeat here, from day one, they do not want to reinvent the wheel, because there's no point. Like, everybody's using the GRI standards and other frameworks for a long time, and TCFD is an incredibly useful recommendation, right? So what EU is trying to do is to, for instance, in July, early July, the EU Commission Working Group they signed a deal with landmark deal with GRI, as GRI will be the co-constructor of this EU sustainability report. So all of the effort is to provide and facilitate the market of, trying to respond to the demand. And we all know we wanted to have a comprehensive set of standards. So for this particular climate prototype working paper, is I capture some of like the policies and the slides, but they also follow a lot. So based on GRI standard, TCFD, and CDP. So it's just some of the slides. And my response, and thank you. Yeah. My response to one of your questions. So it takes a long time to develop every standards, right? And from beginning, GRI has always been the multi-stakeholder model, which is incredibly important. We cannot just listen to one of the constituents group. We need everybody's participation from every corner of the earth. So EU sustainability reporting standard would be in the future as the mandatory standard for business operating in EU, but I think it will be also a global reference as well. And GRI will, in time, revising and adapting to integrate the set of standard.
Okay, I understand. So really, that's a question I should be asking to the EU designers of that policy. So if we could shift quickly then to this question of stakeholders, does GRI have a position on, like, so when we talk to companies, we see that sometimes they struggle to identify all the stakeholders that they should be communicating with, and then they just struggle how to communicate with them. Does GRI have a position or recommendations on how companies can identify the stakeholders that they need to communicate with, and then strategies to do so?
So it's a very interesting question, because GRI is a global standard setter, and it is you as reporter, it's your job to identify your stakeholders, right? But it's a very interesting question, because GRI will provide not our position, but will provide a guidance. Like the one of the slides, there's a step-by-step guidance of how you identify your material topic. So who are your stakeholders? Basically, stakeholder including your shareholders, your investors, your employees, your customers, and your community where you operate from, right? Your stakeholder, even including the regulators. And very importantly, and very often everybody forget about it, your stakeholder, including those business partners in your value chain. And so this is kind of a guidance, right? GRI provide a guidance, but it's you winning your responsibility, because it's a global set of standards. So it very much depends on where, which capital market you operate from, right? Because a lot of time when you are starting to report, the first step of the reason is because you wanted to fulfill regulatory requirement, right? And so that also depends on which capital market you operate from. So GRI, we constantly working with the policymakers and all the capital market regulators around the world. And we make sure it's like a set of global standard that everybody could reference from.
Thanks. Does anyone else have any comments on this question? Yes, Ian, please.
Yeah, Donald, it's interesting, and Verna, and it's great to hear you speak, because we've just we'll be publishing our CSR report here in Taiwan for the first time, actually. And so we publish obviously at group level. We have a variety of reports and standards we follow. And we've adopted GRI here. So it's very familiar to me as the CEO, because we did go through a whole stakeholder mapping of who did we need to engage with. We got third-party advice around this as well. And what was sort of the cornerstone of the messaging that we wanted to give under the CSR report, both from a kind of as-is perspective. So what is it we've done today? And what is it that we're going to do in the future? And with a view that, you know, in the future, that may be less certain, of course, right? And then actually, so it was an interesting journey for me to kind of go through that. And then we had Martin, we had from your side, from BSI, do the certification of it, actually, so that we then, when we go out publicly with the various statements that we make, we've got some quality assurance effectively that says that, you know, it was up to a certain standard of disclosure. So actually, everything both of you have been saying today is very familiar with me. But I have to say, we did, to get it right, we did get third-party advice to come in and assist us with that process, because having my management team go through it, it's not something we're all familiar with, right? So you want to kind of make...
it's a great process, and it is all about as GRI, we often tell the market, it's never just about the reporting. The reporting, it's the output, it's a publication, right? But it's about the process, and it's incredibly useful and practical, because when you, especially when you are doing this exercise for the very first time, you have a opportunity to look internally with your cross-department communication, and externally, like you say, doing stakeholder mapping, right? To identify both your stakeholders, who you wanted to communicate, as well as your material topic. And just one final comment, sorry. Like, so Taiwan Exchange has always been our great partner, because in Taiwan, they're mandatory to use the GRI standards, and so we are always like very proud of the sustainability reporting in Taiwan.
I think Ian raises a really good point here, doesn't he? In terms of, it's a conversation, it's about collaboration, it's about organizations working together. And I think, you know, one of the key issues for me is we're all learning from each other. And actually that process of learning is accelerating some of the change that's going on. And I think that's really important in this conversation, to no single organization has all the answers. And actually we need to be humble in our approach to say, where is best practice? Where can we learn from each other? And then actually we're all starting to move forward, we're all starting to evolve. And I think one of the questions in the chat was about things like PAS 2060. Well, PAS 2060 was written back in 2014, I think it was. And we're growing, we're learning, we're evolving. And that's part of this process of change, isn't it? How do we do that in a more effective way? How do we break down some of the silos to make sure that we can actually grow quicker?
I think it's a great point. In the same way that we're seeing the shift from shareholders to stakeholders, it's from, you know, business and silos to partnerships. And sometimes those partnerships are with unusual partners that companies may not have considered before, whether that's government or NPOs or rating agencies or other businesses within their industry or other industries. So that's a great point. I'd like to shift to this question of carbon pricing, because internal carbon pricing with companies is one of the more powerful ways that businesses can understand the potential impact of policies, and then help them start to put internal strategies to move to net zero, whether that's creating prices within business groups for transactions that are happening, or using shadow prices to decide investment decisions for future facilities or business lines or products. So Ian, I'd like to start with you. As a bank, how do you use carbon pricing in your structuring of deals or of your decision-making process? I'd also like to hear H&M position on that as well.
Yeah, Donald, it's a great question. It's actually quite nascent in its use in the structuring of deals and the likes. You do see it come up a little bit more on the advisory side. It's certainly, and really good example is, as a UK regulated entity, we've just submitted our stress testing under the BES, so the biennial exploratory scenario, right, which has three scenarios, and carbon pricing is one aspect of that you then need to introduce to your stress testing and kind of going out 30 years. And that's a stress test that's looking at what is the impact on your risk-weighted assets and your potential risk of loss, right? And whilst none of that today forms any part of kind of capital setting from a regulatory perspective, one can anticipate in the future that it might well become part of the capital setting and capital review process for any bank. So we've just gone through that. That was a great learning experience for us. And then the other thing I would say is what we're seeing more of is kind of the incentive type structures coming into financial structuring. So can companies reach certain emissions levels over a period of time and get incentivized structures in terms of the pricing of their facilities and the likes, or equally penalization, or where do they rank in terms of whether it's sort of Dow Jones indices and the likes. So you're seeing today more of that coming in, but I think that it won't be long before carbon pricing is used a lot more frequently in terms of structuring and thinking about those structuring. But one of the things is having that kind of uniformity of a carbon market, which the world doesn't have that today.
Yeah.
Right. So it is disparate in nature. The largest one, and has been around for a while, we talked about it earlier, right? The EU market. But if you go beyond the EU market, actually they're relatively small. So I think all of this is a learning, I think, for everybody.
I'd love to pick your brains at some point, Ian. I know we're not supposed to do this in a panel debate, but we're involved in the Mark Carney stuff on scaling voluntary carbon markets. And the conversation we're having at the moment is exactly the one you raised, which is what's the market failure? And if we're going to create a new governance model and new standards to do this properly, what problems are we trying to address? Because that becomes really powerful. If we can get that carbon market working in the right way, it's going to be a really powerful change for everybody, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. We're actively, as you're probably aware, Martin, engaged in that as an organization. And similarly, just one other comment, we did announce a couple of months back Climate Impact X, which is a new venture, ourselves, Temasek, SGX, and DVS out of Singapore, looking at establishing what we call in terms of quality carbon exchange and marketplace, right, to try and tackle exactly some of these issues. And Singapore as a regional financial hub, is a great place to be putting some of that innovation in. And whilst we don't have all the answers, there will be a lot of use of technology out there to develop that. And part of that will also be focusing on what we call natural climate solutions as well. So kind of where does that money get invested into, right, as part of that kind of offset arrangement? And how do you get comfortable with the quality of that disclosure, right? So that, if I'm buying something for, make the numbers up, $50 now, I know exactly where the $50 is going to provide the certain level of offset. So none of this is straightforward, but I think it's exciting.
Yes.
At the same time. So I wish I had all the answers.
Exciting and challenging, I think, isn't it?
I think so.
Yeah. Well, it could be that with the conclusion of COP26, we can put away our crystal balls and we actually have something solid to move on, right? That seems to be a lot of where the uncertainty is. But So Chiara, could you talk a little bit about H&M had set a price, and why did you set an internal carbon price, and what is the function of it within the business?
Yeah. We started working with the price on emissions internally since last year to actually really take the responsibility, right, for the true cost of the group impact. And I think, again, pretty much a work in progress, but the idea is that this internal carbon pricing will help to quantify the costs for the emission for all the different decisions that are taken by the group. So for example, when we design, or when we produce, or when we sell a product. And then in this way, all the product developers can make more informed, and I also like to say inspired decisions when choosing, for example, where to produce an item or which material to use. And in this way, it's also a way to, let's say, raise awareness internally of the real cost of carbon, and then let's say without affecting the final price to the customers. But what I think it's interesting, because in my presentation I talked a little bit about the foundation, right? So I think maybe someone is wondering then, how does this carbon pricing strategy link with the H&M Foundation strategy when selecting projects, right? When selecting the winners. And actually, the foundation and the H&M Group have different and complementary roles to play. Because of obviously the H&M Group works with circular efforts connected to the business and the value chain, right? And H&M Group is obviously taking a circular approach and has the vision to become positive by 2040. While the H&M Foundation, which is, as we said, privately funded, it's a non-profit and it's independent, they aim to be like a catalyst for change, right? And accelerate the progress. So this is to say that while the H&M is, of course, responsible, the H&M Group is responsible for the commitment that they have made, the H&M Foundation has the role or the ambition to push the whole fashion industry forward without having, let's say, the risk of lost investment, that maybe a bigger company would have. So this is a little bit where H&M stands. And also I would like to tap into a little bit the topic that we raised before, from shareholders to stakeholders, because obviously for H&M being clearly a B2C business, we see as stakeholders the customers as well. And we had a question in the chat about any action together with customers to reduce the CO2 emissions. And so, of course, there is, because we love to engage and bring the customers on the journey together with us. And I think I can give a couple of examples. And the first one is the garment collecting initiative that is running in every store, in every market. And that, of course, would not be there without the customer. So every customer can come and donate their garments and receive a thank you voucher for that. And then the other thing is our Take Care initiatives, where by driving education and sharing with the customers, tips to repair their garments, or do it yourself inspiration, or how to do laundry properly, then we aim to extend the life of the garments, but also to treat them in a way that is better for the environment. So of course, customers are together with us on this journey.
Martin, did you want to comment on part of Chiara's answer?
Yeah, this is a great conversation. So many thoughts in my head. The one I was going to, or two I was going to add, I suppose, is I'm starting to see, when it comes to companies, the use of reverse bidding. So when people are starting to think about providing a product and service, it is about quality and it is about cost. And then the second layer that's coming in is reverse bidding on impact. So if I'm producing a product, I want to make sure it's fit for purpose, but actually, can you now tell me what the impact your product has in terms of carbon or in terms of water? And I think some procurement, people are actually doing some really clever tricks now to make sure this conversation about carbon, about social impact is really coming alive, to say it isn't just now about price, it is about the impact you're having. And I think if that becomes more prevalent, that becomes really powerful. And then the other comment I was going to make is we're starting at BSI to play with the idea of what's the B2B offer in terms of change, and what does that look like from a B to B to C? So what role does the consumer play? And this picks up on a point that Verna made earlier, is that the consumer now is a change agent for corporates. They're becoming more inquisitive, they're becoming more questioning of organizations. And one of the things we're starting to play around with is, can you come up with a digital label that says, this product that you're holding in your hand, it might be a trainer, whatever it might be, has got, ocean plastics in it. It's this is the carbon impact. And when you finish with this product, you can bring it back and it will be part of a circular economy. It'll be reused, remade. And when you start to think about that as a supply chain in terms of transparency and honesty and sort of buying decisions, it becomes very powerful. That's a very different place from where we are at the moment, but it's changing rapidly.
Absolutely. Well, if I can, let's start from the customer. We call it customer, some other companies call it consumer, but it is the same. It's all about them, obviously. And I think that you talk about transparency. I also talk about like storytelling, because obviously there is so much choice, right? So then the moment we want to get like a customer to buy like a t-shirt from H&M, then they are buying into H&M, right? So of course the customer centricity is key. And as you mentioned, like customers are more and more informed, informed, and more the expectation is higher and higher. And actually what you think, I mean, it is happening already, this transparency in some of our markets. We have on the product page on the website, through the HIG index, we have a very clear number about the impact that specific garment is bringing, let's say, into the world. So that's already reality. Then now it's about scaling it up. But I really believe in customer centricity, because if we don't, like, without the customer, we are nothing. So of course it's like the journey, it's together with the customers, for the customers, what it is that resonates with them. And it's also about being locally relevant, because what speaks to a customer in Taiwan is probably different from what speaks to a customer back in Stockholm or in Italy, where I'm from. So I think this is very much top of the agenda for the future.
To bring that to the B2B question that you asked, Martin, Ian, in your presentation, you mentioned that that clients were going to be looking at the risk that suppliers were presenting them in the transition. And I think that's kind of a similar sort of thing here, where you could start to see deals being made, as you described, Martin, but on embodied carbon in products that are not the end product. Do you have any thoughts on that, Ian?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we provide sustainability product into the supply chain, right? So, if company A that we're providing financing to has a broad supply chain base, right, that they're purchasing from, and one of their requirements is, to go to Chiara's point, which is around, what's the emissions intensity of the suppliers, and you're finding, because this crops up in terms of, if you're thinking of scope 3 emissions and the likes, it starts to crop up there, and you're starting to tackle the more difficult parts of it. Then we're saying, well, what financing solutions can we provide that says, actually, we can give incentivized financing against that to incentivize the suppliers to be more green in what they do, and the likes. And so you start to look at it more like an ecosystem in that effect. And I think that there's a lot of creativity that's coming out of that. We've got a number of products out in the market today and clients that we're working with in that particular space. Because I think Chiara's point, they're our clients, they're demanding it, right? They're demanding solutions of us as banks. You banks come up with solutions to help us here. And this is where I think everybody's got that role to play.
We're getting up to time, but I'm going to continue asking questions until Wayne cuts me off or any of you guys leave. So Martin, it sounds like you've been having a lot of interesting conversations. To follow on that, are there any other examples you've seen of innovative activities or business models that companies are applying to start to move towards net zero targets?
To be honest, it's the bit that really excites me every single day. Different organizations thinking in different ways around some of the challenges that they're facing. The one space that I think is becoming really exciting is the move from product to service. And I kind of touched upon it really briefly in my presentation in terms of mobility as a service. So you're starting to have conversations with the BMWs and the Mercedes, the big sort of OEMs of the world, saying maybe our market is about energy, not mobility. And I think that kind of reminds me sometimes of Tesla's mission statement, which is all about energy, not about mobility. So we're starting to see different organizations move into different spaces. But in that same kind of space, we're seeing organizations saying, well, I understand my product better than anybody else. So maybe I just provide it as a service. So great conversations with companies at the moment about, I don't sell you a roofing solution, I sell you water tightness. So I will come in and I will repair or replace that because I know my product better than anybody else. And I will learn from putting sensors into the product. So when it fails, I can understand what I can do better. And I take that product back and I bring it back into the circularity. So great conversations in that space. Lots of ideas in terms of how innovation is driving change. And I think it's a point that Verna made earlier on, is that if we take our current reporting mechanisms, it is all data. And I think, the point that Ian was making a few moments ago is that we're going to get to a point where the relationship between risk management and sustainability are inextricably linked. And actually, we need to be quicker in terms of understanding what that looks like. So doing some work as well with various large corporates around asset management in terms of buildings. And can you start to rate those buildings in terms of their return on investment, in terms of how they're operated? Are they buildings, for instance, that are net zero? And what does that mean for an organization that wants to purchase them? And that's all around data and performance. And can you use AI as a way of actually making those decisions in a more effective way? So endless conversations. And I think, to be honest, today's conversation has demonstrated it. We as a group have got lots of ideas, but we're actually only sharing a small percentage of all the things that are going on in the market.
Yeah. So thanks for all the participants who joined us today in the audience. And next Wednesday in Taiwan, the Global Corporate Sustainability Forum is happening. So if you are in Taiwan, you can join that. I believe probably if anyone has any follow-up questions, they could send them to Wayne at the Taiwan Association for Renewable Energy. And thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Have a good
See
day.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.